Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our book discussion. We have Dr. Paul Thompson here, and we have Johannah Myers here as well. Both of them are going to help facilitate the conversation that we have. And the title of the book just slipped my mind.
Guided by Faith.
Guided by Faith. Yes, thank you. I was going to say faith over fear, but it's not that. So, divided by faith. I'm going to go ahead and let them go ahead and speak. I don't know if you guys prepared anything, but feel free, go ahead and let's have some good dialogue.
All right.
Great. Thanks. So tonight we thought, so this is a book that Paul teaches regularly in his classes at North Greenville. So I'm going to defer to him as the expert. I work in a Methodist church here in Greenville. So this is, it's stuff that's familiar to me, but this is his jam. So I'm going to let him kind of take the lead. So what we thought we would do is kind of do like a little bit of an interview format. So I'm going to ask Paul a couple of questions, things that I've noticed about the book, things that we kind of feel like are key to understanding this research. And that way, if you haven't quite finished the whole book, hopefully you'll be able to kind of hear some of these main topics. And then after going through that, and feel free to use the chat or to stop us and ask questions. And then after that, we thought we would talk about how some of this research that the authors have done might apply to current topics today. So this book was written, I don't even remember when, but before 2020. So we thought we'd kind of see how this research applies to some of the stuff that we're seeing. So that's where we're headed for this evening, if that works for everyone. So kind of the first question, the authors start out by talking about how we live in a racialized society. So Paul, what do you think they mean by racialized society, and how do we see that demonstrated today?
Right. Well, looking forward to this conversation. As Johanna says, I taught this book at North Greenville, and excited about this conversation tonight. And thank you, especially for those of you that are repeats from our last conversation. So glad to see some of you back again. Oh my goodness, so much to say. This book is very different from the last book, and like our last conversation, so you want to talk about race. We're not assuming everybody's read the whole book, and obviously in 1 hour, last time we went about 90 minutes, you still can't discuss a whole book in an hour or 90 minutes. So just, we're going to hit some highlights. That's the best we're going to be able to do. Try to discuss some of the aspects of the book that are either most relevant or most critical to the argument of the book. Now, this book, one of the big differences is that this is written by two professors of sociology. So this is written by two academics. They were at Rice University, did this research in the mid to late 90s. And one of the amazing things about this book is that a book on race that could be over 20 years old and still have some very relevant arguments. There's several key ideas that Emerson and Smith bring up. One of them is this phrase, racialized society. And very early in the book, they have basically a whole paragraph that they devote to defining it. The sentence, they have one sentence that they put in italics, and I realize probably most of you read this, may have been a little while, or maybe some of you haven't read it. So I'm just going to read this one sentence. It says, a racialized society is a society wherein race matters profoundly for differences in life experiences, life opportunities, and social relationships. Race matters profoundly for differences in life experiences, life opportunities, and social relationships. So they say a lot more about it, but a critical thing that I appreciate, because while these are sociologists, I'm a historian, and historians love to look at change over time. and many sociologists are historical sociologists. So one of the things they do is they point out that America has always been a racialized society, but has not always had the same kind of racialized society. So that America has had 3 periods of racialized society. The first one was under slavery. The second was up to the end of the civil rights era, in which we had Jim Crow, lynchings, and legal segregation of all sorts. And then we have the post-civil rights racialized society. So their phrase covers the statistics, the data that everybody basically knows, right? That if you're going to look at the percentage of African Americans who have a college degree versus the percentage of whites, we know there's going to be a lower percentage for blacks. If we want to look at a household income, right? Median household income, average household income, everybody knows it's lower for blacks. If you want to talk about household wealth, right? How many assets, right, do black people own or black individuals own? And you want to compare that to whites. Everybody knows it's lower for blacks. Much lower, actually, exceedingly much lower. And that hasn't changed a drop in over 20 years. If you want to talk about sort of any long, I mean, they have several pages here where they go through a bunch of statistics. Infant mortality rates, right, are worse for African Americans than for whites. Even maternal death rates are worse for blacks than for whites. So you can go down a whole long list. And so the word racialized society is a phrase that captures that reality. But it also captures things, I like the phrase because it captures things that are far more subtle. So, for example, whether or not you've had experience, I suspect you can easily imagine it. Imagine going to somebody's birthday party or somebody's wedding or somebody's maybe retirement celebration, and 1 or 2 things happening. Imagine everybody there being white, but everybody, in the neighborhood or at the job is not white. And then the second thing that we can imagine is that, maybe 1 black person will show up or 1 Asian American will show up. And then what else is very imaginable, very believable is that, at the end of the evening, if somebody were to say, you know what, everybody here was white. It's very easy to imagine somebody saying, oh my goodness, I didn't even realize that. I didn't even think about that. I mean, like, I totally wasn't like, I wasn't thinking about that. And so this sort of acceptance, but sort of blindness to it, or another element of racialized society is sort of our acceptance and understanding that certain things are normal. So for example, a neighborhood in a town that's mostly black. If you grew up in the town, you're not black, but, somewhere probably by 15 or long before 15, you're like, oh yeah, well, blacks live over there. That's just their part of town. Like, that's just how we say it. Like, everybody just knows that, right? And we just go on living. So where we just sort of accept these things, like that's the black part of town, like, why is that the black part of town? No one asks, right? You just like, everybody just knows that's where blacks live over there. And sure, there's some elsewhere. But so sort of this unthinking acceptance that people just live differently. Blacks are there, whites are here, or this like, I didn't even realize there were no blacks here. So this sort of, so the word racialized to me captures all of these realities that are, structural, non-structural, individual, collective, historical, traditional, custom-based, right? Racialized captures all of that.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, like the author points out, particularly in this 3rd period of history, their racialized society, that a lot of the racialization is covert and invisible to whites. And I think you just gave a couple of really good examples, because I can tell you in my hometown exactly what neighborhood, that makes perfect sense. And it probably wasn't until I was in my 30s that it occurred to me to think, why is that, why? And, right. And kind of what led to that. So this idea that, you know, when you read through this, the intro and the kind of first chapter in the book, it feels very obvious. And yet, in reality, from a very day-to-day perspective, for many of us, the extreme racialization of our society is very covert. It's very normalized. It's very invisible.
Yeah, I'm so glad you
white
mentioned-
people, at least.
Yes, right. Yeah, it's sort of like, I almost want to say it's subliminal, right? It's below the line, below our level of consciousness.
Right.
Accept it as a given. It just is. That's
Right.
how Americans live. And I appreciate, you know, some of you may have read an e-version, but in the paperback version I have on page 9, he lists 4 traits of current racialized society. And the first one is what Johannah just said, increasingly covert. Secondly, embedded in the normal operations of institutions. Third, we avoid direct racial terminology. And fourth, we are invisible to most whites. And so, yeah, that explains how racialized society works in America now. And that's why it's easy for certain people to say it isn't there because of those traits. So those traits really they don't just describe how it is, but they describes what causes it to continue to be. Those traits explain how it keeps getting reproduced.
Yeah. Akif's got his hand up.
Okay. I hope that that's fine to ask question in between.
Yes, please do. Jump right in. Just make it a discussion, please.
Okay, thank you. So Paul, when you talk about racialized and unthinking acceptance, you gave the example of the white social gathering, and then so that's correct when I kind of think about it. My question is this true for the other side, if it's correct to put the name as the other side, you know, because we are talking about race. So let's say, do we have the same unthinking acceptance when non-whites get together and only 100% non-whites? And then if someone asks, you know, did you pay attention, there's no white over here tonight, you know, oh, we didn't think about it. Do we have the same thing really applies to that community too?
That's a great question. Wow. Yeah, that is a great question. I thought a little bit about that before I gave that illustration. I guess I don't have a simple, straightforward answer. I have 2 or 3 thoughts. My first thought is that if you take the example of, wow, okay, so I use the example like a retirement party at the job. So there you could only expect a racial diversity roughly comparable to the racial diversity of the job, obviously. But if we're looking at a wedding and who's invited to a wedding, if we look at a birthday party, right, who's invited to a birthday party? Well, that's just whoever is your social network. Who do you choose, you know, for your friends? So I think that the reality is, you know, if we go to a strictly social thing, I suspect there's very few, this is hard to say. Let me start here. Blacks like being the only, Black people generally feel like their psychological guard is let down when there's no whites in the room. Very frequently, Blacks feel less psychologically stressed, which is one of the reasons Black people like to go to a church with only Black people. They don't feel they have to measure their language. They don't have to measure their attitude. They feel there's a freedom they feel without whites. So quite honestly, you know, if Blacks choose a social gathering with only Blacks, it's an intentional statement that we don't want to have to feel guarded.
Well, don't you also think it plays into what the authors are talking about in terms of like how racialized society affects our social networks, and where a gathering of all white people and a gathering of all Black people, like socially, from a sociology perspective, that makes perfect sense because we gravitate towards those that we are most like. The problem is that our networks are based on who we are like and who we hang out with. And it's more harmful for Blacks right now in the sense that their network is limited kind of more toward, does that make sense? Like that they're kind of talking about how this, how, because we gravitate towards like, kind of like groups, networks are smaller, which then affects how we get jobs, right? Or how we make connections, beyond. So,
There's a lot of, I guess the only reason I'm hemming and hawing is because I think maybe I mentioned this, I don't know if I mentioned this in the last conversation. There's the whole struggle of diversity within, not just between. So, in other words, I'm very much so an opponent of describing the Black experience as monolithic. There's a lot of different experiences in the Black community, as there are in the white community. Those differences have to do not just with the level of education, but where you get your if you college education, right? I mean, if a Black person goes to an HBCU, or if a Black person goes to a white school but joins a Black sorority or a Black fraternity, that's a network that puts you in a different sort of life trajectory than a Black person that goes to a private school and never joins one of those groups, or never goes to a white school and never joins one of those groups, or or goes to an HBCU. So there's a lot of different things. It matters if you grow up on the south side of Chicago or in Harlem, or if you grow up in a suburban neighborhood that's very highly mixed, or if you grow up as a military, kid, a military brat. So there's so many variations. So it's a little hard. So we're talking about, yes, general patterns, and just know there's a lot of diversity within there. But yes, I agree with what you're saying.
Sheila's got her hand up.
Yes.
Thank you guys for offering this this very timely subject. Paul, also thank you for the honesty and the vulnerability to say that Black folks can be more authentically themselves if there's no white person in the room. I have been blessed to have been working with this, intentionally working with this subject in my own life and my lived experience around what is missing, what has been lost by not having more friends of color, not having a more diverse experience. Because as Johannah was saying, I grew up in a small southern town and there were very clear delineations. And so life was very white until I made an effort for it to be otherwise. And I have Black friends who will say that being the only Black person in the room is sometimes an invigorating and exciting experience. And other times they say, I just don't want to have to be this stand-in for all people of color.
Right.
And I want to be where I can be me. And so I love that you're saying that between and within, because we don't even understand the conditioning that we're bringing to the room, to the table, or to the house of worship. We don't even understand that. So thank you.
Sure, thank you. And please jump in if anybody wants to ask. I mean, this is, or just make a comment or reflection, or tell a story, because, at the end of the day, I mean, none of us live literally in books. I mean, we live. I mean, we have experiences, we have relationships, we have incidences, things occur, right? We have jobs, we have neighbors, we have relatives, we hear stories. So yeah, bring those to the table, because some things, you can read them in the book and people can study all day and all night, but if you have experiences that are contrary to that, they're still real, and so we have to bring those into conversation with the scholarship.
Yeah. Yolanda's got her hand raised, I think. Yolanda, the iPod.
Let's see if Yolanda on her iPod, if she can say anything. I don't know. Might be hard to do that. Keith, I was gonna share. I've been in a couple different scenarios where I kind of took it in and said, "Oh, let me just see how this feels." I know I was in an elevator and at a convention somewhere, and I was I was in an elevator, and I was the only white person in the elevator, and I was like, "Oh, let's see, how do I feel? Like, you know, I wonder how this must be how it feels in a way, in a sense, for somebody that's a person of color to be the only person of color in an elevator full of white people, you know? And so I know that there's differences. My kids one summer went to Phyllis Wheatley, and I can say Phyllis Wheatley to you all, and if you're in Greenville, you go, oh yeah, that's the black area, or that's Nickeltown area. Like, you just automatically know.
Right,
you know?
right.
They were the only three, there were only three white kids. And they had a hard first week. And it was funny because the lady that was the director said, you know, it's a different culture. And I said, absolutely, I totally understand. And I'm immersing them in a different culture because this is what they need. They need a different culture.
Yeah, and so the bottom line is, you know, the Black experience from the vast majority of Blacks, I mean, unless you're able to, like, you know, live morning, noon, and night, like in Harlem or a South Side of Chicago kind of thing, you know, unless you're able to do that, the vast majority of Blacks spend a whole lot of time in that context, in that relationship. You know, being not necessarily the only Black in the room, but always being the minority in the space. And so Blacks sort of by nature have to become bi-dialectical. In other words, sort of have two different languages, or by nature bicultural, maybe. You know, they sort of, when I say they have to, what I mean is one could argue that the most economically or socially successful Black people are moving in predominantly white spaces, but they've learned how to do that. And that is a separate skill set from how they conduct themselves when they're around all Black people. They will change. I mean, quite honestly, for me, I'll say at least around certain Black people, I will talk differently than I do as a professor. Yeah, I mean, I will change my language, but then there's other, you know, things too that, you know.
Yeah, and I think some of that is even just part of human nature, because I can shift some of how I might speak. But with my mom, when my mother is here and she's from New York, born and raised for 20-something years, when she leaves, I can take my kids to their speech therapist and they can talk to me and go, your mom was here, wasn't she? We can tell because you're speaking with more of a northern accent and you're using I'm phrasing differently.
Right. And so we all do that in various ways. And one of the ways we do that is it can be along racial lines. I mean, there's other ways to do it. But sure, we right.
Okay, I think Yolanda's ready to go ahead and ask her question. She said she took her phone off mute. All right.
I think when people call in, the facilitators need to unmute them, that they can't unmute themselves. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, I can't do it. There's no way for me to do that. When it's an iPod or something like that, it's different.
Yolanda, can you type your question in the chat box?
Yeah. I did message her. I did message her privately and asked her to.
Okay, yeah, because we can answer it that way.
Yeah.
Do we want to move towards the next question? And then Yolanda, just feel free, kind of, if you can get it in the chat, or we can always circle back. It's all related at this point.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
It's all related at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that the authors really kind of draw in terms of how it develops over time is, like, in the latter half of the 20th century, the evangelical church, and you might need to maybe speak a little bit about what we mean by evangelical church. But the evangelicals developed this theology, this way of talking about God, this way of talking about reconciliation. So that was a big kind of key word in the evangelical movement in the late 20th century. So how does that theology of reconciliation begin to kind of play out, and how might we be kind of seeing some of that affecting, you know, some conversations today? Because I think that's important for us to understand that was a really big movement, and a lot of our church people are still kind of caught up in that same language of reconciliation.
Yeah, so, all right, so this is a great question. So, the subtitle of this book is called Evangelical Religion and the Problem of Race in America. Um, so, in recent years, the word evangelical, its meaning has been hotly debated among people who self-identify as evangelical. And the issue is, if I can use a metaphor, if a couple of you talk about growing up in small towns and such, and if families are in a town for a long time, and everybody knows, well, that's the Jones family, oh yeah, we know the Jones. There were five kids in the Jones family, and everybody knows what the Jones family is like. You just say Jones and everybody, all of a sudden, they can check off their boxes, right? This is what the Joneses are like. Well, here's the thing. If you actually are a Jones, and you're the middle, that there's 5 brothers and you're the middle brother, you probably see yourself as quite different from the younger brother, the youngest, right? Or you see the differences between you and your dad, even though you're all Joneses, right? But everybody else says, well, that's the Joneses because we know how they are, right? So here's the thing. Evangelicals have the same sort of kind of thing going on. If you don't accept that label and you label other people that, you see them as one group. But if you're in the group, you see all these fine nuances and subdivisions, between which there can be substantial amount of bandwidth devoted to fighting and arguing with them over this, that, and the other thing. So that is one thing I noticed coming from the New York City suburbs, that I think that, in an area that was very non-Protestant, very non-evangelical by however you define it, evangelicals are them. Being in Greenville now for the last 15 years, and at North Greenville University for 14 years, I feel like, I'm in the family and I see all the differences now, or I hear all the differences. So here's the thing. When this book refers to evangelicals, they are referring to theological evangelicals. It would be fair to call them theological conservatives. So holding to the old historic doctrines of the church, about 125 years ago, 150 years ago, some new doctrines emerged. Evangelicals basically have rejected these newer ideas, approaches of how to read the Bible, how to think about Jesus. Evangelicals have rejected much of that scholarship for the last century and a half, with varying degrees of energy and effort. And so what the reconciliation theology that Johannah is asking me about in chapter 2 is, or chapter 3, I guess it's discussed, chapter 3. It focuses on people like Tony Perkins and Tom Skinner, on African Americans who grew up in very difficult situations and contexts. The last thing they had was a silver spoon in their mouth. I mean, there were middle-class blacks in the 1950s, but these were not them. These individuals convert essentially to a conservative theology form of Christianity, not what we would call mainline, not moderate, not liberal Protestantism. They convert to this conservative theology. And they come up between the 80s and the 90s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. What Emerson and Smith do is they actually borrowing from another scholar, but they summarize 4 main ideas of reconciliation theology. First of all, that the way to bridge the racial gap is through individual friendships. Number 2 is to recognize, understand social structures of inequality. Number 3, that whites need to repent for, and this is personal, historical, and social sins. And number 4, then in return, that Black people then need to forgive. And so these are sort of 4 highlights of reconciliation theology written between the 70s and the 90s, primarily by African Americans, for which, there were many white evangelicals who came alongside them and agreed and supported and worked with them. Now, the critical thing about this is that the point 2 and point 3 are the sticking points. And what I mean by that is this: in that broad umbrella called the evangelical world, even though these African Americans were prominent, wrote books, pastored churches, led organizations, nonprofits, were founders, so on and so forth, even though they had plenty of white allies, they led massive meetings, despite all of that, huge chunks of the white evangelical world just could never get their head around points 2 and 3, or their heart around points 2 and 3, or their theological frameworks. This concept of structure, just like, it was like a square peg in a round hole for a lot of white evangelicals, that there are social structures, not just individual actors and actions. And this concept of historical and social sins is a real problem. So when we read this book in my class this past spring, and we discussed it, all my students were white. I believe they all would claim the evangelical label. They're all one was not evangelical. One was not a Christian. The others were. When we discussed this, and I said, so I'm talking, to 20-year-olds in 2020. I'm not talking about people living in the 1980s, but I said, so, how do you think, like, if you went and taught these 4 points in your church, how would they go over? Woo! Yeah, that, especially that social sins one, they said, no, people wouldn't. They said, and so it's interesting, right? Because I'm a history professor, not a theologian. So, in a history class, I wasn't going to argue them down on social sins. I gave them some Bible passages. I suggested they could read on their own. But these, basically, I guess what I want to say, I said all that to say this, Johannah, that these men, I believe were largely men, but the leaders of this movement brought to the larger evangelical community, and certainly the white evangelical community, through theology and through all the institutions and much of the language they were already comfortable with, 2 ideas: social structure, structural racism, and this idea of social and historical sins, which white evangelicals really had rejected both of these ideas for decades. And to this day, I think what I would say is that there's a far more robust conversation because of what was done in the 70s through the 90s. There's a far more robust conversation among white evangelicals about these ideas. I have read in recent, just last 2 to 3 to 5 years, multiple posts and blog posts attacking a social conception of sin, written by white evangelicals to white evangelicals. It's like they feel compelled to address this matter because people are talking about it. Other white evangelicals are talking about it. So these ideas have definitely increased in their profile in evangelical circles. And,
So I feel like that kind of brings us into kind of the last question that we wanted to just kind of talk about, and then we can get into maybe some more practical things, is that the authors, Emerson and Smith, talk about, they identify, I think it's 3 main cultural tools. And it's funny that, because like when you're talking about the theology of reconciliation, the stopping point for white evangelicals is the idea of social sin or social, any kind of social, like corporate, community type reconciliation or community ways of addressing race in America. So these cultural tools, these kind of 3 main tools that the authors talk about, maybe we can talk kind of briefly about those 3. But also, and one of the things that I've noticed, and I think the authors point this out too, these cultural tools are evangelical, but they're also uniquely, I would say, American. So they're things that The American church, particularly the American kind of conservative or evangelical church, has taken and run with it. And they're very entwined with this idea of not just being a Christian, but also being an American. And I would say that you wouldn't find these cultural tools in other churches and other Christians outside of the US. And do you think that's a fair, kind of a fair statement?
It's so true. What's so annoying to me is how unaware how many American Christians are of that fact. And that's really disturbing to me. But yeah, so like all good sociologists, I don't know how many of you have read books written by sociologists before, but basically it seems to me that every time I read a book written by a sociologist, they are quoting some theory or model or framework created by another sociologist, and they apply it to the subject they want to study. So that's what they've done here with the sociologist Swidler and this concept of a toolkit. And so basically the argument is that cultures create ways for individuals to organize their experiences and evaluate reality, interpret their world. That's what cultures do. So there are certain sort of elements, discrete tools that people apply. And so for people for whom religion, or Christianity, I should say, is really, really central to how they look at the world, they're arguing that there are these three concepts, one called accountable free will individualism, which they distinguish from progressive individualism. And that goes to your point, Johannah, that basically, if we wanted to make a list of terms to describe American culture, what Americans are like, somewhere in that list, we would have to include the word, we are very individualistic.
I think that might have to be top on the list.
Yeah,
of how to describe.
Top. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Oh, I agree.
Individual freedom.
Right.
For
exactly.
sure. Yeah.
It's all about that. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting is when you get inside the family, again, there's all these distinctions about, well, what do you mean by individualism? What do I mean by individualism? Or how far are you willing to go in this individualism, right? There's always degrees, there's a continuum. So they're arguing that, to me, it's a very helpful distinction that they do in the chapter titled Colorblind, which is chapter 4, between this progressive and this more conservative, if you will, individualism. And then they talk about the word relationalism, that for evangelicals, and I can come back to that if you want. I'm sort of kind of maybe assuming people have read this, but I can talk about it in more detail if you would like. That's no problem. We have relationalism, that white evangelicals place a lot of emphasis on interpersonal relations, or if you will, individual one-on-one relations are really, really important because they help shape and mold our decision-making and influence that. And the individual is responsible for making good decisions, and that's what accountable free will individualism implies or focuses on. And then finally, they just use this word anti-structuralism, which they're just basically saying that when you talk to white evangelicals, what is glaring is the complete absence of an ability to even, never mind think about, but to even like have a language for social structures impacting, influencing, controlling individual behavior. There's just like, it's just a gap. It's a glaring hole. They have no way to talk about it, no way to think about it. And no matter how they would question, like they say on this one page, even when we explicitly asked about the possibility of systemic institutionalized aspects of race problems, respondents had difficulty seeing anything other than an individual problem. It's like, it's just not in their brain, like they don't have a word for it. So that complete absence of structuralism, these are the three things. And what they say, they call them the core cultural tools of that evangelicals use to understand and explain race in America. I would say they are conveniently cherry-picked ideas that derive from certain biblical teachings. They are convenient because of how our culture has evolved over the last few centuries. And so people conveniently pick these ideas out of scriptures to apply in this way. Which then to me, again, using my paperback version, so pages 76 to 80 describe this tool set. And to me, the next section of the book that's like the other side of the coin is pages 94 to 98, which basically is the next chapter, and it walks you through how these views, these three tools, are used by and how they differ from white evangelicals, white liberal Protestants, and Black evangelicals, how they explain racial differences based on what is called the General Social Survey. So if you want to explain why there's so much difference between Blacks and whites, you can see how these three tools are used to interpret and explain the racialized state of our society right now. And you can see how it varies. And so there's a lot of statistics there, but I guess I'll pause because I think I've talked enough or too much. Thoughts or reflections or any questions, or Jana, if you want to follow up on that, or?
Sure. Keith.
I'm sure I might have too many questions over here or comments. If someone else has, please jump in. So as a Muslim, I kind of, when I look at this book, I think that's very kind of in one way educational for me to see how the racism here in the United States is stemming from the religion. Because back until moving to the United States in 2004, maybe I didn't have the concept of racism except few times in my lifetime because of the news or maybe, somewhere, it was really not dominating in my thoughts or life. Right. But once I moved to the United States, the first thing when I came to airport, I came to Tallahassee, Florida. And when my older brother, he met with me and he kind of welcomed me. And he said, what is the first thing you pay attention in the United States? I was at the airport. And then I said, the weather is too hot in Florida, okay? So that was kind of because when I really exit from the airport, kind of in August in Florida, so the weather was extremely hot to me. And I said, this is too much humidity. Right. And that's kind of really the thing I thought it was different from what I had in Turkey. He said, no, this is not the thing that you should have paid attention. I said, what was it? He said, did you not pay attention around you? Some different people over here. I said, what do you mean? He said, the African Americans, at the airport, see Black people. And I said, I really I pay attention because definitely, but I didn't think in different ways, this is different from Turkey because I never thought in terms of racism. He said, this is a major thing in the United States. Okay. So that was maybe the first thing. When I arrived to the United States, I was welcomed with unfortunate reality. So to kind of really brought to my attention about the racism, it was kind of a little shocking for me, to be honest. But then, because then when I kind of became more part of the social gatherings and part of my learning over here, I kind of witnessed this. And as this kind of book emphasizes, I think I feel the faith has a very dominant role, not the faith necessarily, but the evangelical Christians, as you put over here, I think that the church as institution has a major impact on that, the vision or in the racism. But the kind of problem, again, as a Muslim, I do not kind of really comprehend how would that be possible, that to my understanding from Christian faith, about my understanding of Jesus being the pure love, that's something I'm so thrilled. And I love that when I see our Christian fellows, they kind of emphasize Jesus is love, God is love. That's something I truly love this concept, I believe in that. But so then, how could that be possible too, while you have that much emphasis on love and Jesus, and then treat others as you want to be treated, love your neighbor as you kind of, so there are many things that it's like the golden rules, right? We kind of call the golden rule. So then how is it possible still it can be a part of institutional problem, not individual problem? Because that's what I kind of feel. It is really not an individual problem. It is taught through the institutions. And now we see many African American churches, right? This is, even though some of the African Americans, they are evangelicals, I'm not sure, right? And so how would that work really together? As a Muslim, I try to understand this dichotomy, like what's going on and how do you kind of reconcile those kind of things together? So if you can really address to that one, and how the people feel comfortable, why they are teaching this, and on the other side, they kind of practice the different thing. So how would that really work?
I think it really goes back to what Paul was saying about how we cherry pick. So like how we have a tendency to pick certain verses that then become prioritized over and above the entirety. And I would say even like, unfortunately, for some kind of subgroups of Christianity, they've picked verses and themes that they've even prioritized above some of Jesus's own teachings, which is incredibly frustrating for some of us. But this idea that I don't know, that you can kind of take something out of Scripture and apply it in a certain way. And so even to a certain extent, the idea of like a more maybe progressive Christian would read Jesus's Sermon on the Mount in Matthew or the Beatitudes and see them not just from an individual perspective, blessed are the peacemakers. Oh, I need to be peaceful. I need to be at peace in my own heart, might be one way of, an individualistic way of looking at it, where maybe a progressive Christian would say, okay, what does it look like for us as a society to be about being peacemakers? So I think we get caught up in this idea of we pull out certain scriptures and then those become like the end all be all, as opposed to keeping the whole together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and the fact that happens, or I should say the way that happens is, again, it's sort of like unconscious, Keith. People don't realize that they're doing it. They're doing it because that's just the nature of the kind of teaching they're exposed to in their circles, the people they listen to. And so the word is, and I guess, and I know Islam, the Quran is the same thing, and I've asked you similar kinds of questions. Some of this goes back to the word hermeneutic, so how we interpret, right? How do we understand what a Bible passage means? And so there's whole courses on this in seminary and in school, and so we have to interpret things. And the bottom line is, the quality of interpretation varies a lot in Christian circles. And but I think culture blinds us. Our personal economic needs, our aspirations, what we can get away with, all these things have a way to sort of press in on how we choose to live out our faith and how we choose to interpret our sacred texts. So, but Christians are subject to that. I want to go back, Keith, your reference to, you see racism, we talk about racism as structural. When we use the word structural, we're a lot of times we're just trying to explain why there are these disparities, right? Why do we have one town, Black people, white people born in the same town in the same month, the same week, and one grows up this way and the other grows up that way. They went to the same school, but very different outcomes as adults. Why is that difference? Once you start counting that, then these numbers grow and you see patterns. And those patterns are what makes it structural, because it is patterns. And people are simply, I don't want to say simply, but there's an aspect to which we're simply counting. We are counting. right? We're looking at numbers. We're saying, wow, how come these end up this way and so few end up this way, or so many in this category versus that category? What are all the steps along the way that cause Black people to have such little, shall we say, wealth, accumulated wealth and assets? Why do Blacks have, what is it, like 1/100 the assets of white people? I mean, it's some crazy, ridiculous low number. There's a lot of things that get us there. All those steps that are together make for structural racism. So really, those things exist all around the world. And if, you know, in another conversation, I'd love to talk to you more about Turkey, because every society has got different groups. They're just not white and Black. You know, there's different names. I mean, you look at India, what, they got 20 different groups. I mean, then they have the caste system among Hindus alone. And you know, you pick your nation of the world, right? I mean, every nation has got different groups. They just don't look different like Black and white. I remember when you took me to Turkey, we were somewhere in some city, and I remember there was a lot of, it was like a city square. There was some area of the city, and as we were talking, you or someone else pointed out, to my untrained eye, I'm going to say they look like Turks. Everybody looked the same, quite honestly. But it was pointed out that they were not Turks. They were another group of people. And the point is, Turks would know that, but I wouldn't, you know, I couldn't tell, but like there was a group doing whatever. And so, you know, and it was not what we'd call an in crowd. I mean, it was a minority group. It was a foreign group. And so, you know, every society has, but just in the United States, it plays out racially. And Black-white is the most extreme example. We could talk about Hispanics. We could talk about how Japanese are treated, Chinese are treated, Philippines.
I want to get back to Catherine. Catherine's had her hand up for a while. Okay. So I want to make sure she gets a chance to ask her question or to speak.
And after Catherine, Yolanda messaged me the question that she had.
Oh, good.
Awesome. Good. Great. Okay. Catherine.
Having my hand up virtually is just not nearly as exhausting as
yeah.
So it's totally fine. No, I really, it's helpful to me to read this book. I'm a Christian, and so, yeah, like Paul was saying, some of this is, you know, I get the, like, within the family being able to tell, like, differences that others can't see, but I enjoy hearing the perspective and reading perspective on Christianity in the U.S. And certainly on the white church in the U.S. from the perspective of someone who is outside that. So I think that is very helpful. But so it's helpful for me, for them the authors to articulate how common it is for white Christians in the U.S. to focus on the individual and on a sin issue. And that's definitely how it was taught in my home growing up. That's how I was taught in my church. That's how I was taught in the church my parents are going to now. The church I'm going to now is very focused on the systemic issues. But because of the history of that not being the case, for the most part in the white American church, that is extremely difficult for us to navigate. And my sister is in Atlanta. She's also a Christian, and she goes to a church there, and her pastor, who's one of the pastors who officiated her wedding, very close, he is Black, and he actually stepped down. He was not the senior pastor, he was an assistant pastor, and she was devastated, but he stepped down about a year ago because he was just so burnt out from being in the minority racially in the church, and trying to carry so much of the burden of that church. And they're trying to do good things and to fight for justice and be honest about racism and look at the systemic problems, not just the individual. But so I'm going to a church that's in it's a PCA, it's the Presbyterian Church of America. It's theologically conservative. My church is not politically conservative. We're kind of all over the map. So they're different terms to me, but that might be the family distinction that Paul is.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Theological versus political conservatism. But anyway, so the PCA, my denomination did not issue a public, the leadership of the whole thing did not issue a public call for repentance or recognition of the sins, what we would say the sins of our church in perpetuating and protecting racism until 4 years ago. So it's a year after the Charleston shootings, and and so it's just, so we're trying to sort out, like, what does this look like now? And a lot of us in my church really wrestling with, like, is this something where we even need to, like, break from this denomination altogether? Does this look like starting something new, planting in tandem with a Black church? Like, what is this? We don't know. And it may just be a matter of, like, of time and continuing to fight and build trust and learn and listen. But it is hard. And I appreciated that difference being recognized in this book, because it's definitely one I've been thinking a lot about for a while now.
I think their language is really helpful in understanding. So I hear you. I'm in a United Methodist Church, so we are all over the place, and a good many of the people in my church have come from, were raised in Southern churches, and they might not call themselves evangelicals. They might have been Methodist all their lives, but this language of kind of a conservative Southern church is very much at play. And so when we start to have any of these conversations, they have this tendency to default to these cultural tools. And the burnout is real, because you feel like you're speaking two different languages. So it's helpful to kind of have these tools in front of us to understand kind of where the language is. And I think for me, one of the frustrating parts is how so many of these cultural tools are wrapped up, not just in what it means to be a Christian, but also what it means to be American.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to separate out so-called patriotism, which is not necessarily honest patriotism, but that, so for example, in the book, they talk about this individual, accountable free will individualism, and how the underlying assumption is that everybody has a fair shot in life, which is the leading proponent of the American dream, right? Everybody has access to kind of pull themselves up by their bootstraps.
Right.
Idea that everybody's got a fair shot. So you just have to work hard. You just have to, to be motivated to kind of make good choices, etc.
All failure is individual then.
And so that's very much this American dream, and it's very much kind of embedded in our story of what it means to be American. But then it's also embedded into our story of what it means to be Christian. Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily what the Bible has to say about this. And it completely denies the systems that are in place that make it absolutely impossible for everybody to be on a level playing field. But it's helpful to have the language in order to know kind of what we're trying to, so that we are kind of speaking common language in order to start to mitigate it a little bit.
Yeah, white evangelicals are, I just want to just quick, white evangelicals have an extreme version of the national individualism thing going on, basically. Yeah, and in the South, it's like doubly extreme. So, yeah.
Yolanda, she messaged and she said, is it safe to say that interpretation of the Bible is some type of guiding principle that may define our beliefs? That was what she was saying.
Wow. Yeah. So obviously, again, that varies within the family, broadly speaking, of Christians. It varies in terms of how intentional people are with that. Certainly if one, is a clergyman and self-identifies as a liberal Protestant, it does, because they're going to explain their approach to things using a particular kind of hermeneutic, a particular kind of interpretation. And likewise, people that say they're proudly conservative, they are going to just dismiss out of hand some of the conclusions. Johanna gave an example before, from the Beatitudes. She pulled one that's like, there's two different ways we can interpret this. So there's a reason why certain Christians are interpreting a verse one way, and there's another reason. But again, every Christian is nowhere, just sort of like every Muslim is not nearly that intentional in their thought. They just go along with, well, that's what I've always heard kind of thing, right? So if people grow up in different settings, but I think the problem or the challenge is that culture influences more of us, more than most of us are willing to admit. And when I say culture, I mean, the Bible is not nearly as important as some people pretend it is to how they think. It isn't.
Keith's got his hand up.
No, sorry again. So
Don't apologize.
In terms of interpretation, I think, Paul, I get your point, but I have a question. So in Islam, one of the most used hadith, Prophet Muhammad's saying, is misinterpreted by many fundamentalists as their foundation of recruiting people to be jihadist. So this hadith is called, if you find an injustice anywhere, try to correct with your hand. If not, if you are not able to correct with your hand, then correct with your mouth, with your words. And if you are not able to correct with your words, then hate from your heart. At least this is the weakest point of the faith. So it means there are three levels that when you face an injustice, you have to intervene with your hand, physical prevention, if not physical, verbal prevention, if not verbal prevention, then at least try to hate from it, from your heart. This is the weakest point of the faith. So, but I don't think that Prophet Muhammad promoted or provoked violence with this hadith. It kind of emphasized in the importance of justice, try to bring justice to any individuals or society. But now when the jihadist groups, they kind of recruit the support, they use this, now we have injustice in our community, now we have the strongest faith, it is our time to really use our hands. This way, how we can use our hand, here's the weapons, here's this and that. They can bring a lot of things to argument, right? So I wonder, Paul, part of the Bible, what kind of verses or passages that really used to somehow justify the racism, even though in different interpretation? Is there any kind of really main verses, like the example I gave in the hadith, any verses or any passages the evangelical whites, they kind of really uses in different interpretation to justify the racism?
Well, currently most conservative whites, because of the nature of the third era of racialized society, most conservative whites deny that there is a racism problem in America. And so they're not using scripture in an active way to defend it. What I can say is historically, if we go back to the first period of racialization when slavery was legal, the primary passage, which has a fascinating history, and there's several things written about it, is the so-called Curse of Ham. It's a fascinating passage because when you trace the so-called Curse of Ham back historically, you can find both Muslim scholars and Jewish scholars, as well as Christian scholars, referencing this concept. If you go back over 1,000 years, or I want to say it goes back to around 1,000, maybe earlier. So all have used this concept where Noah's son, saw him drunk, Ham, and Ham's brothers covered him up, according to the story in Genesis. And of course, the Bible says that Noah cursed Canaan, who was Ham's son, and it said that Canaan's descendants would be servants to his brothers. Somehow along the way, that got, thank you, Johannah, Genesis 9:20-27. Somehow along the way, unfortunately, somebody thought that was a curse of Ham, but it's very clear in Scripture it's the curse of Cain, and I don't think anybody debates linguistically the name that's in that passage. But this argument was brought up that that's why, and then of course, ancient scholars said that Ham's descendants settled in Africa, and so this was used to justify slavery, but also to justify essentially, it was a biblical argument for racial inferiority that would have been genetic almost, but I mean, it was a theological defense. So this became very popular in the U.S. after 1830, because after 1830, from 30 to 60 is when the abolitionist movement was big. And so prior to 1830, there's very little published defending slavery or defending enslaving of blacks compared to after 1830. And that last 30 years before the war, white American Christians went on, it was an explosion of scholarship from a theological perspective, but also scientific too, but defending it. The other thing that was used back in that era is what we call the household codes, both Paul and Peter, but primarily the places where Paul talks about servants obey your masters, which technically, if we go back to the word there, it would have been slave technically, and the English translation made it servant for all sorts of reasons, and that's another fascinating conversation. But it's he urges slaves to obey their masters, and so people have used that. And then there's the story of Philemon, that this is a classic example of a hermeneutic, I would think, about how different people have used it. So Philemon is a runaway slave who somehow meets Apostle Paul, and is converted to him probably while the Apostle Paul is in prison. Once he converts to Christianity, basically it appears that Paul persuades him the right thing to do, since he stole himself, right, which is what a fugitive slave does. They steal themselves from their master. Paul encourages him to return to his master, because it so happens that Paul knows his master. And so this is a very short letter that Christians have interpreted two different ways. They've interpreted it as meaning Paul supported slavery because he told the fugitive slave to return. But there is another way to read what Paul writes, and what he basically says there. So the other hermeneutic would say, Paul says to Philemon, as an apostle, I could order you to free him, because that's my right as an apostle. But Paul says, I will not order you to. I'm going to plead with you as a brother to do the right, loving thing, and treat Onesimus, was his name, treat Onesimus as a brother in Christ, and treat him as you would treat me. And so in recent times, many scholars have been saying, okay, that's really an appeal to, that's a high moral road argument, where Paul's saying, I really would like you to voluntarily set this man free, because he's a brother in Christ and he's our spiritual equal. Now, my friend John Adams just got on the phone, and he actually is far more trained in theology than I. Could probably add more on that if you'd be interested. But anyhow, I think that's the best way to answer your question.
Thank you. Very helpful.
John, did you want to add something? I saw you unmute yourself. Were you just prepared in case Paul called on you?
Oh, no. I have such a deep and profound respect for Dr. Paul Thompson, not only as a scholar, but as a practitioner of the faith. He is a person that I can talk scholarship, at least to the best of my ability. I mean, he's much further along than I am. But also as a brother of the faith, we can pray together. So here is my question. My role as I teach adjunctively at Anderson, but I'm a full-time pastor. That's my calling. But Paul, here's my question. If you had a room full of evangelical white pastors, and they would say, Dr. Thompson, we trust you. Give us one step we can take in our church to alleviate racism. What would be that first step for you?
I think the shortest, most succinct answer I can give goes back to something Catherine was saying before, and I really appreciate her comments. And I had written this down as I was preparing. One of the things Emerson and Smith point out is that conservative evangelicals basically believe that all sin is individual and that all race problems are derivative of sin or are sin. Therefore, all race problems are individual. Dr. Adams, my advice to that population, as you set it up, would be to go into a deep Bible study of such passages as Ezra 9, Nehemiah 1, Nehemiah 9, and Daniel 9, and to study
Wait, Catherine's going nuts. Hold on, slow down. Say those passages again.
I'm gonna write that down.
I know. I was like, wait, I was going to type. So I'm hoping Johannah typed it like so quick.
Ezra 9.
Ezra 9, Nehemiah chapters 1 and 9, and Daniel 9. And look at what happens in the story after those chapters. And basically, I believe, and again, there's plenty of white evangelicals that will disagree with you. One of my professors that's under me at North Greenville recently had an argument with me about this. He totally disagrees. But I believe if you will study those chapters, you cannot walk away from whether you look at them historically, culturally, and again, I've not studied Hebrew, but there's some key words there that I've been trying to do my own little study on. But when you study those chapters, there is clearly a conception of corporate guilt. And I think any movement that pastors can affect from seeing sin as there's only one kind of sin and it's individual. There's virtually no other kind of sin we're talking about. Any shift that a pastor can move from that super narrow view towards saying, you know what, there is something called social sin and there is something called corporate repentance. And when we look historically in the Bible, some really interesting positive things occur when people pray and repent corporately. If we could just agree on that, I think that would move the needle in a lot of churches. Because once you can see that theologically, I think that will, well, the word they use is transposability. I think then you can when somebody talks about the structures in society and why Black men aren't this or can't be this, or why the numbers are so drastically different between the races, and somebody starts, then it'll start making more sense when you see that it's in the Bible. I think you can transpose it.
That is a superb, and Paul, we might just have you come over to our church.
Well, I need to do a lot more study. I'm happy
been
to.
looking for a way, but could I offer one word? We throw around, and I was teaching a college class at our church, so I was a little late getting on, but we've used the word evangelical a whole lot. I don't know if you've already defined it. We did. Because that's been my life study. And there, I think Tim Smith talked about it being a kaleidoscope. And so many times we narrowly define evangelical to mean the narrow-minded back. And you have the progressive wing of the evangelical movement too. So I would caution us against being too narrowly focused on this definition.
Yeah, very good. So I want to jump on that because there was something I wanted to say towards it. One of the reasons I like this book is because I think there's something here for three populations. There's something here for, I'm gonna say my fellow conservative theologians or fellow conservative evangelicals, in that you realize the balance that is lacking in many circles. You realize the balance that's lacking when you read this book. For liberal Christians or liberal Protestants or mainline Protestants, this is an invitation, or someone like Catherine, the way you were talking, this is an invitation to someone like you. I just want to say, help your more conservative brothers and sisters out with scripture. With Bible passages, with a hermeneutic, to help them see things in scripture that they're missing. And then for a Keith, for those who are, so to speak, not in the family, this gives you a language. Joanna and I were talking about this. For those who are not Christians, it gives you a language to understand where conservative evangelicals are coming from. So it gives you, well, when you have a language or something, you can think about it when you have words for it. And you can talk to people, and dialogue can be more productive if you have a way to think about how other people think. And I don't just mean people that are not Christians. I'll say people that are secular, people maybe that aren't religious at all. Keith is definitely not secular. So, I mean, for people that are secular, maybe they don't adhere to any religion. I think many of them find conservative evangelicals very confusing. But this gives secular people also a language to understand what's going on.
Keith?
John, welcome. You know, even though I do not see you because you joined from the phone, but it seems your question is to me, is very deep, and the answer is equally deep.
John is deep.
So I think that was wonderful. Like as Paul said, even though I might not apparently be part of the family, but I'm part of the human being family, right? We are the human family.
You're part of Abraham's family, so that counts.
Yes.
We have many different ways to define in the same family, right?
Yes.
So, that being said, I think like this is a great question, you know, John and Paul. It's a great answer to me, to my understanding. You know, I think that definitely makes sense. Just want to make this comment, you know.
I just want to say sometimes it's okay not to be in the family. Sometimes you go, yeah, no, I'm good.
Sometimes we'd like a break from our families, both those that we are born into and those that we have chosen as well. So one of the last things that, and I know we're reaching kind of the end of an hour and a half, but one of the things that Paul and I were talking about when we were talking about how these cultural tools are being played out. So the book was written, what, 20 years ago?
Yeah, late 90s.
Late 90s. More than 20 years ago, perhaps, which is scary. So specifically towards to 2020, like in our context and kind of the things that have blown up the conversation about race most recently have been issues surrounding police brutality. And so I think one of the things that's really helpful in as we've read this book is looking at how these specific cultural tools get applied to the discussion and argument about this particular issue, and then also how they are being applied to proposed solutions. And I just think that's kind of a helpful way of taking this maybe more academic book that is 20 years old and kind of saying, you know, there's some really good things here for helping us understand the conversations that we are seeing, the arguments that we're seeing, and also the proposed solutions that we're seeing. So for example, this idea of accountable free will individualism, this focus on the individual, how many times have all of us heard, it's not an issue with the police force, it's bad apples, right? So it's about the individual, not about the system. So that's just maybe one example of something, of a way that we've seen these cultural tools kind of being worked out in 2020. Paul, did you have any?
Well, that's one way. I think another way is, you know, is sort of kind of this thing of if simply usually a man, but not always, if the man who was stopped by the police simply acted differently, there'd be no problem. So, you know, it was all about the individual choice in the moment, and so that there's a rejection of comparing these violent incidences. So that is also a product of this accountable free will individualism. Yeah, that would be a product of that kind of thinking, that kind of value.
And so again, from the relational cultural tool, that relationalism, proposed solutions are more about, let's sit down and talk to one another. If we were all just friends, right? Which is not a bad thing. And I think to a certain extent, the authors kind of in the later chapters, when they're talking about the role of churches, you know, relationships are important. Nobody's saying that they aren't. But again, this idea that just better relationships can somehow the miracle motif that they talk about, that better relationships will just kind of magically solve the institutional problems. So I would encourage all of you to kind of think about the ways that the things that we're hearing in the news, the things that we're hearing around our own dinner table or in our own churches are being affected by, like, people are bringing their own cultural tools to the table and to the discussion. And these are three pretty major cultural tools that are being used around many of our tables right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. Where do you think, Johannah, the whole concept of community policing falls into that? I mean, is that based, is that a corporate response, or is that an individualistic response? Because people talk about, police walking the street, walking the beat, talking to individuals, being known, a face of the, I don't know. I think for me, one of the big things when answering John Adams' question, I am very much so convinced that our solutions are going to be both about individual behavior and simultaneously addressing corporate, institutional, systemic problems. I'm very annoyed by an approach that's either or, because it doesn't to be either or. As a matter of fact, either or clearly doesn't work. I feel like we've tried both for a long time. Obviously, there's no advancement in many ways. I mean, there is advancement in American society, right? Because I wouldn't be who I am and where I am. Society hadn't changed. So I thank God for the changes. I'm glad I was born in 65 and not 1925. I mean, I think the issue is a both and approach. We need a corporate and we need an individualistic. A person's choices do matter, but structures and systems do matter, and they're real.
Right. Absolutely. I think we talked about this some in our last discussion in terms of education versus action. The need for educating ourselves, but also for moving beyond just the obtaining knowledge into actually action. And that it's not an either or, it's a both and. And so from the same way, it's about education, it's about action, it's about the individual and individual responsibility, but it is also about addressing the systems that are at play and the larger corporate kind of responsibility.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, Cindy. Yes. I agree. I love your post. The books written 20 plus years ago are still relevant. Is it because we haven't progressed? Exactly. I mean, and what's amazing to me is when you read the statistics about the differences between blacks and whites, I mean, statistics haven't really changed in 20 plus years. I looked up this one number, median income of blacks in 67 was 59% of whites, and they said in 94 it was 62% of whites. I found the 2013 number, it was still 62% of whites. I mean, nothing has changed. That's why we can still use the book, unfortunately.
I don't know if I can speak. Yeah, I go to several groups, Speaking Down Barriers and other events, and it just seems like a lot of people like to say, well, people have come so far. And I find that to be such an excuse to not do any more work.
It is.
Not really sure how to address that a lot of times to them, except for, but, and I hear people of color try to, say, but we're not there yet. And it kind of gets into an argument. Speaking Down Barriers, not familiar, is a place where black and white folk come together to talk about issues. And the Greenville chapter actually had to disband after the Jacob shooting. It got so tense that black folk did not feel comfortable enough around white folk. Mm. And it's just starting to come back now. And it started in Spartanburg, but it's a group that also works with the Race and Reconciliation group of the bishops out of Columbia after the Charleston shooting. is a group that I belong to in Columbia also. But it is a lot of people. I just feel you'd like to use that just to stop working. Well, we've come so far. You know, it'll take time, but how long? Like Thurgood Marsh stood on the court steps before and said, you know, I believe in social retractability, but 100 years is enough. When he argued his point for the Supreme Court. So, yeah, I often feel that we're stagnating, and I'm not sure how to get out of that. How do we get out of that?
I would find it interesting that people will say that, but I'm a foster parent, and there are I've had kids that they've asked me when they come to my home if my Bible says what their Bible says, you know, and I said, well, what does your Bible say? And, you know, they'll say, well, my mom and my daddy said that our Bible says that white people and black people aren't supposed to get married. And I said, yeah, nope, it doesn't say the same thing. I'm sorry, you know. And you know, we've had this one family, their son ended up going into a black foster home, and they were throwing a fit over it. And the DSS said, we're sorry, we don't make any suggestions on color or race, and your child's where your child is, and that's it, you know. And I remember, you know, this was like 5 years ago, and I remember just going like, wow, people are still teaching this prejudice, you know. And it's just no, you know, and it's like you want to go like, haven't we moved past this? And no, it's still there.
The idea that we've come so far is always interesting to me when you think that we've come so far to a line of basic humanity, and there we stopped, right? Like you know, this idea of we've come so far as to say, you know, Paul's not 3/5 of a person as opposed to like a full human being. That to me isn't coming so far. That's like we've reached, you know,
yeah, and sometimes
the baseline, and now we need to actually like move past that.
Yeah, I think
it's very frustrating.
That you associate with, you know, the circle that you associate with might be at a certain point, but when you start integrating yourself with other people, like, you know, complete outsiders that I would never put myself in the same room with, and that would be their opinion, it would be like, whoa, you are way behind in the times. You know, like, you know, or just like shocks you, because I think we'd like to all think we've come farther, you know, but yet you can still go into a school and you can still see prejudice and racism, you know, between students and teachers even sometimes, or between faculty, or between volunteers and students. And I mean, it's still there. So there's still work to be done.
Mm.
We need to probably wrap up here.
Yeah.
When is the next meeting for this group?
Okay.
Christina, what's the next book?
Oh my.
I don't have, Don, thank you for that question. I don't have a next book picked out. I was working on trying to get something picked out for September as a book reading, but I will say, if you have a suggestion, please let me know. But I will say that on the 20th, we are having a COVID topic dialogue discussion. And on the 27th of this month, we're having one on racial reconciliation. So we've mentioned racial reconciliation about 5 or 6 times tonight. So we are actually having a dialogue conversation.
So this book is for one night for tonight.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Look forward to the next topic.
Yes. So the next one will be a discussion on racial reconciliation.
I want to thank Johannah for joining us tonight, because I made a point of making sure we had such a great time last month when we discussed So You Want to Talk About Race. And it wasn't clear whether we were going to do this together or I was going to do it solo. And so I said, please join me. And so thank you for joining us. I think it's been a great conversation.
It's been awesome. I've learned. I'm glad you picked this book, because I don't know that I would have read it, and I'm so grateful that I did, for sure. So thank you guys for such great discussion and great questions.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Wonderful.
You know, in the chat here, Akeith put the link for the next upcoming event, and we can do. I would like to continue some other books, because I think this is a great conversation for us to continue to keep having. So stay tuned, because we will go ahead and pick the next one. Because I think the conversation has to continue forward in order to, because we are not there yet, right?
Yes.
So we're not there yet, so we have to continue the conversation forward.
All right. Well, I look forward to seeing hopefully a lot of people next time, 2 weeks on the 27th, right?
Yes, and the 27th is our racial reconciliation dialogue discussion. So
Thanks so much, Paul and Johanna. You did
Thank
wonderful
you.
job,
If you
and
could all
thank
like
you
to
for everyone.
unmute, you can unmute and say goodbye and good night and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so
Good night.
much.
Hey guys.
Bye.
Thank you for
Comments?
coming.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
Bye.